Hello, this is Brett Lonsdale, and I'm here with Jeremy Thake and Sandy Ucia. And Jeremy's going to be presenting Microsoft Graph API for us. So, welcome, Jeremy.
Hi, mate. How are you?
Very good, thank you. So we're quite a few hours apart. So thank you very much for joining at this time of the morning from Seattle. And
Yeah,
yeah,
you're
first of
welcome.
all, great. So Jeremy and I go back quite a way. I think I've known you in three different countries. So,
It's
well,
true.
so obviously, yeah, you're a British guy. I can tell by your accent, which there's a little bit of British in there still, I think, and some Australian, and I think there's a few Americanisms coming in now as well. But
Yeah, I mean, I've lived here now for 10 years, so some of it's starting to creep in a little bit.
so yeah, it's been yeah, I guess a long time that we've both worked, seen each other along the way at different events around the world and so on, and mostly different SharePoint events and things like that. But yeah, you've been with Microsoft for quite a few years now, and tell us about Graph and how you're working within that team.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I appreciate it. I think it was great kind of agreeing to do this because obviously the majority of products actually are powered by the Microsoft Graph, which I'm the program manager. That there's a team of us that lead up the Microsoft Graph overall within Microsoft in Redmond, and it's always great to support partners that are building on top of the graph. And I think, especially with what you're going to show, Brett, the notion of understanding what the graph is to be able to kind of really empower those products that you've built is really, really important. And so I've put together some slides today just to kind of frame the graph. And for those that are joining, thank you. And the way I frame this is it's not going to be like crazy developer. I wanted to kind of talk about this more from a conceptual perspective and then point you to resources if you did want to go away and write code. And I think that's really because I understand the audience with the Lightning Tools team of being more power users and administrators and business analysts and not necessarily writing a lot of code. But just fair warning, you will see some code just to introduce some concepts as we go through the slides, but we won't be kind of going into the deep weeds of writing code in this session today. So I'm Jeremy Thake. I'm a principal program manager in Redmond. As I mentioned, there's a very small team of us that sit across the whole of the Microsoft Graph, and then there's actually more than 50 different engineering teams within Microsoft that own particular parts of the Microsoft Graph within the company, which is really exciting to kind of be in the overall head of the Graph family, working with all the sibling products that are in there. It does cause quite a few challenges, as you can imagine, and I'll share some of that as we go through in the way that we do things and how we release and so forth. And so if I just jump to the first slide here, I wanted to just kind of showcase this as the future of where we're going with things at Microsoft. If you've been paying attention to where Microsoft is going, essentially we're releasing new devices all the time now from a hardware perspective out of the Surface team. And we recently announced that we will this fall, if I put my American tone on, but Christmas for all those folks over in England and Europe, will be releasing these new devices called the Surface Neo and the Surface Duo, which are essentially foldable devices that the smaller one will be running an Android operating system, and the larger one will be running a Windows X operating system. And one of the big questions we had from people was like, well, what does that mean from me being able to get what the information I need to make myself productive on these devices? And ultimately, Satya, our CEO, answered with, well, all of the data that we have within our organization is essentially accessible via the Microsoft Graph. And so as a developer that wants to build an app for these new devices or even our existing devices, you'll be using the Microsoft Graph to, with the permission of the user, access data from within inside of Microsoft products and services. And so one thing that I always kind of lead with is that Microsoft Graph actually powers our products. So I'm assuming all of you are using Outlook to access your email inside of Office 365 or even Exchange on premises. And when you launch Outlook inside of clicking New Mail, when you click New Mail and you click into the to text area there, it'll actually going to show you recent people that you've communicated with over email. And the way that's doing that is actually going back to Office 365 through the Microsoft Graph, and it's looking for a query of essentially saying, who are the people that Jeremy communicates with on a daily basis inside of Mail? And it will return that information. But it does more than just return a list of, Dana, Matt, Jeremy, and Sarah, and Charmaine. It'll actually return a list of their photos, their profile photos. It'll show their statuses in those check marks. That'll show whether they're available on Microsoft Teams or not. And it'll also even show, obviously, their email addresses to contact them. And when you add these people in, if you hover over those names in email, you'll see a nice contact card, which is powered by Microsoft Graph as well. But we go to a little bit further. We're also provide suggestions. And so the graph isn't just about insight based on your own activity. It's making insight and making suggestions based on the fact you've typed Jeremy here and how many other Jeremys there are within your organization that maybe are close to you based on other people you've collaborated with in the organization, and making the suggestions that way. So we have this notion of having the access to recent people, pulling in their profile information, showing their statuses from Teams, and even being able to fetch with the contact cards what recent files they've edited, for instance. And so the kind of main concept here is that whether I'm doing this on my Outlook on my desktop, which is that original screenshot, or whether I'm doing it on my iPhone, I'm going to see the same results returned in that experience, because everything that we release is. And so even if I go type in Jeremy within Microsoft Teams search there, those same kind of results are coming back through to highlight all the different places powered by the graph that kind of, in this case, respond with just those people inferences around who I'm communicating with. Now, it's not just inside of Outlook and Teams. Inside of Word, in the latest revisions of desktop and Word Online, you'll notice that if I now create a review comment inside of a document, if I'm giving feedback on a particular document, I can now mention people there, and all of that mentioning capability of showing profile photos and their names is all based on calling back to the Microsoft Graph to get me that list of people based on, whether I've typed in JE or whether I've typed in Jeremy space, to make it easier for me to go pick those people through. And if you've accessed the office.com interface inside of the browser recently, you would have noticed that we have this notion of showing all the different apps you can launch in the app launcher there at the top, but also the recommended documents that maybe people have shared with you recently, or maybe you've had edited and opened recently. And then in the recent pinned and shared with me and discover, those lists of files there are also all powered by the graph based on the various different views. And so the Microsoft Graph is essentially using to return all this information a series of signals, and these signals are actually sent from all the different products that you use. So when you go into Word on your iPhone and you open a particular document, that signal is stored in a private location within your profile within Office 365. And every time you open that document, a signal is sent. And every time you edit a document, a signal is sent. When you open Mail, a signal is sent. And the graph uses all these signals to come up with an intelligent list of recent documents or recommended documents. And it understands the signals that you have based on all the different Microsoft apps that you use. And again, all that information is stored per user in a location only your account has access to. Now, what that means is that as well as all those signals for all the different Office clients that you and Microsoft products you can have access to, is that Microsoft Graph has access to all the content that you store within inside of Office 365, or if you're using Outlook.com, what gets stored within inside of Outlook.com too. And so, OneDrive exists both in an organizational world and in a personal world. So if I go into Word, save a document into my OneDrive, the Microsoft Graph has the ability to go fetch that file, look at the versions of that file. It can even update that file from whatever app you're building that you call the Microsoft Graph with. There'll be a demo I'll show later on that highlights how you can use tasks to manage in a custom application having access to To-Do, for instance, or Planner through the Microsoft Graph as well. And you can see here that, all those common things within Outlook, whether it's mail, contacts, calendar events, are all accessible. And for those of you familiar with Microsoft Teams or SharePoint, when I create a team or I create a SharePoint site, under the covers, you're actually creating an Office 365 group, which obviously is how you manage the security of who's in the group. And it also does the ability of things like being able to create plans for a group, and there'll be a files location for that group. And all those other kind of data constructs that you have are all going to be accessible via that Microsoft Graph when you do this. And the real trick to this is it's all about the user being in the center of this. And from a privacy and security perspective, the only way an application that calls the Microsoft Graph can get access to any of this data is if the user consents to have access to it. And it's at a very granular level. So for instance, maybe I'm building an application around making it a lot easier to manage a shopping list. My shopping list app doesn't need access to my files or my calendar or my contact lists or my mail. All it needs is tasks. And so the Microsoft Graph has an ability to essentially ensure that I can granularly have my application ask the user, I would like permissions to access tasks within Office 365 on your behalf. And the user, when he first launches that application, will have to grant those permissions to that particular application. So the reason we actually call this a graph is because of the technology behind it. We talked about those signals, and we talked about the different types of objects that we have. Now, in a very straightforward sense, what that means is that, and this is the bit where I said I was going to show some code, is that the graph is basically making an HTTP request back to our service. And in this case, you'll see that everything is done via this notion of me. Now, when you think about this, it's very easy to read. You can kind of almost see what we're seeing, what we're going to ask the graph for by going me/events and select the subject. In that case, all we're doing is saying, return me all the events, or the top 10 events in my user's Outlook calendar, or go get me the top 10 OneDrive files from inside the root folder of the OneDrive folder for that user, or find me a list of all the rooms that I have access to as a user within my organization. Now, the graph can get a little bit more complicated because of the fact that you can pivot across various different aspects of things. So finding me the OneDrive files that a user edited in Word last week is actually going to be using a variety of different constructs and signals to come back with that list. Or schedule a time for a meeting with a group on their work Outlook calendar is going to have to take into account the availability of a variety of users' calendars and when they have free slots on their calendar. And create a to-do task for a user based on a Word comment that was left in a that they own. And so having that notion of activity going on based on signals that are happening within Office 365 is a really powerful way that we ourselves use the graph to power our products, but also that you as a citizen developer or as a professional developer can take advantage of in your own kind of business solutions and custom applications that you build. So I always get this question, well, what are the most popular data sets? And I will say that there is a slight bias here because of the age of how long things have been available on the Microsoft Graph. The graph has been around for about 4.5 to 5 years now, and essentially the most common ones are the ones that have been around and the most established, not just in the graph, but also inside of Office 365. And I think my kind of hypothesis on this is because these are the workloads that users are adopting the first when it comes to Office 365. So the mail messages, accessing mail and sending mail on behalf of the user is something that is the most popular thing that is done inside of Office 365. But what's interesting is that conversations that are happening now in Teams has really picked up. And so as organizations actually start adopting Teams and creating kind of business processes around Microsoft Teams, they're seeing that having the ability to read a conversation and make some insight into that particular conversation in Teams, or even for a conversation to be replied to using the Microsoft Graph is extremely powerful to help users as they go through their day-to-day job. And so these are the most popular data sets that we see. But as you can see, there are a lot of other particular data sets that are available on Microsoft Graph. And so for this audience that obviously have been using or interested in Lightning tools that are in that SharePoint world, obviously I've mentioned files already, but from the Microsoft Graph, you can also get access to things like the SharePoint sites. You can iterate through all the site collections that are available inside of the tenant for the users. You can iterate through and manipulate SharePoint lists. So if you've got custom lists or document libraries, you can kind of iterate through those lists and do those things. And you can even create and modify and obviously delete SharePoint pages that live maybe on those new hub sites and various different community news sites that you have within your organization. And so we see a lot of companies that will have various different business processes where they'll want to use the graph to go provision sites and create particular news items and various custom lists with data in it to scaffold up for a particular project. And so the Microsoft Graph allows you to go do all that very easily, either via things like Microsoft Flow, all the way through to Power Apps, all the way through to custom applications that you write, developers write code in. So Microsoft Graph, is a way of powering experiences that are individually helpful in the sense that, if you're creating data within Office 365, it's going to make that one person productive. But when you start thinking about how those data sets can be blended together, they can be really collectively powerful as well. And so the most successful things I've seen done with the Microsoft Graph are taking a variety of those different entities that are available inside of Microsoft Graph and coming up with really kind of intuitive and innovative business solutions that help users become more productive on a day-to-day basis. And so the easiest way to get started here is if I go over to one of my many profiles and we go to developer.microsoft.com/graph, and this is the Microsoft Graph homepage. And we have a variety of things you can go get inspired by looking at the different solutions that you can build using the Microsoft Graph. And we're actually just about to update this with a variety of other scenarios to try and inspire you on the different ways that you could kind of build data sets within Microsoft Graph and build these really nice applications for your users. And then we have this notion of Graph Explorer, which I'll demo in a second. But just for the developers in the room, depending on what language that you're using, so for instance, if I went to .NET Core, we have the ability to essentially go in a tutorials type fashion and from scratch, I'm assuming a little bit of knowledge of .NET Core, go and build your first application with all the code, and it explains the code as it goes through it. So if that is something that you or developers within your organization want to get kind of comfortable with, the Get Started area is definitely the right place to go from a developer. Now, for kind of anybody, when we see a lot of business analysts, we see a lot of administrators using this, Graph Explorer, and I've switched on the preview here because it's something that we released Ignite in November, allows me to kind of explore what's available in the graph outside of just those slides I just showed you. So for instance, on the left-hand side here, we have all these different sample queries. And so you can see that we have our most common ones up the top here. And so the most obvious one is /me, which is going to give me the basic information about that particular user here. In this case, it's Megan. And you can see her office location, her preferred language, her name, and so forth. But I can also go get, for instance, Megan's photo. So the examples I use at the beginning there, it's that simple to go get that information from the graph. And with Graph Explorer, you can do this very, very easily by just clicking on these samples on the left-hand side. Now, this is going to return these things in a JSON format. So for those not familiar with this, essentially things like Power Apps and Flow can read this structured data and pick out individual values by just using the name of the value to fetch the sent date time of that particular mail, for instance. or to look for the, whether that email has been read or not. And again, you could do all sorts of business processes around this with the Microsoft Graph. Now, I just want to touch on one thing around this, which is that if I go to my profile here and I click on the permissions tab up the top, what this allows me to do is to understand what consent my application would require to be able to run this particular command. And so in this instance, if I asked for user.read, this would allow my application to sign you in and read your profile. And so if I'm building a custom application, like what I'm going to show in a second, I would need to ask the user when they first sign into my application that my app requires user.read. And if my user consents that particular permission, then my application is allowed to go call Microsoft Graph with that /me. If my user rejects or declines that permission, if my application tried to call this URL, it would not work. And so we put the power of what access an application has into the user's hands, and they have the ability to control that at any point in time. So we often get customers concerned about how much access to data applications have if they're using a graph. All of this is done in a very fine granularity of consent. So for instance, if I went and had a look at items trending around me, you'll see that it's a different permission strings that you ask for. It's sites.read is what you would need to look for items trending around me. And if I went in and had a look at various other ones here, you'll see with mine join teams, or if I was after, some of these don't have the permissions just yet because we're in preview, but you'll be able to see all the different permissions that are required for each of the different calls. So the Graph Explorer is a great place to go explore the Microsoft Graph API and play around to see what kind of data you get back. Now, by default, when you use Graph Explorer, we're using a demo account. So everything will be based on this fictitious Megan person. But what I can do is on the left-hand side, I can actually sign into Graph Explorer here. And when I do that, in this instance, I'm signed in as Alyssa. And you'll see now when if I run my profile, it's going to get back Alyssa's information and the fact that she's in a job title of inspector and she's in the field. Her preferred language is also EN US, and her surname is lawyer. And so it uses the context of whoever you're signed into to get those permissions through. Now, you could sign in to Graph Explorer with your Outlook.com account or even your Office 365 account. And when you do that, it will ask you, Graph Explorer will ask you for the various different permissions. And if you don't have them, you can actually click on these things and consent Graph Explorer to be able to run these. So in this case, I've already consented user.read, so it's able to do that whack me. But if I went down to do some other samples, I probably wouldn't have consented those with this account, and therefore you'd be able to go through that experience and see it. And so just to explain that, if I went through and looked at, say, for instance, mail.send, you can see there that it's not consented. And when I click consent here, you'll notice that it'll actually pop up those permissions to give me an idea of what's going on here with saying that it wants to send mail as me, and I would have to accept Graph Explorer in this instance because that's the application that's asking for the information to consent them to use this. So that's really neat from that aspect. Now, to show you a kind of a real world scenario here, I'm going to show a Teams application here that's running within a channel in Teams in a tab here called Meeting Capture. And what this application does is it allows me to track particular meetings. And so it's already added me into the meeting, but I'm going to go and add Todd into that meeting as well. And you'll notice that as I'm doing these kind of people picker type experiences, it's already pulling through things like my photo and the names of the individuals here. And then the nice part is if I picked, say, a time in the future, so I'm going to do this meeting on Friday and I want it to be 30 minutes, it's using the Microsoft Graph here to go and find out what times are available in those two attendees. And then when I click that, it's actually going to go automatically set that time and date for me as when this meeting is going to last. And so, because I'm doing this for my executives, I want to discuss, last quarter, and I want to, strategy on next quarter, and review this. And so this allows me, once I've added these agenda items, to then go through and I can go and add attachments here if I choose. And I'm just trying to think if I have one here that's very quick I can grab. There we go. And when I click save here, that's going to go away, and it's using the graph to essentially go and create that meeting. Oh, it would do. And I'm not going to troubleshoot that. It's going to use the graph to go create that meeting. So if I just go back, I'm just going to see where there's one that's already existed. This was a demo environment I was borrowing from someone else. Let's see if there's an existing meeting in here. Let's go. 2 seconds. And so that goes away and creates that meeting, but it's using things like the fact that I'm going to take my meeting minute notes in my OneNote notebook. I'm going to create the tasks associated with that meeting in my planner notebook, and any attachments like that attachment I created is going to be uploaded to my OneDrive. Okay, it's not going to work there either. So apologies, I won't be able to show you what that looks like as an end result, but essentially it would be rendered, and I could actually in the meeting add my notes and my task and my planner. But as I mentioned before, from an organizational perspective like this one, where I'm in Teams and I'm doing something around my work, the Microsoft Graph makes sense. But I can also do things around my own personal life. And so, for instance, inside of Microsoft To Do here, I have a shopping list which is shared between me and my wife. And we have a bunch of things on here that we need to go get to the shops. And so whoever's near the supermarket is going to go run in and go grab these things. And, she does get frustrated when I ask her to individually add items into this task list rather than just send me a list in a text message, because I like the ability to kind of check these things off as I go. But inside of the app, if I just demo signing in here into my Contoso Foods app, I'm going to just sign in with my my test account here. That's going to go and pull those lists there. And if I just kind of snap this off into the side and just show you this, like this list of information here from the Microsoft To Do is being returned inside of my own custom Contoso Foods application, because it's pulling those tasks directly from the graph. And you can see here that I've kind of augmented the list of food in my shopping list by querying and getting image product names here. So it makes my app much more visual. And so the scenario that we had around this dual screen environment is that as I'm going and doing my shopping, I have the ability not only to, if I click on the product, see on the right-hand side information about those various different products and the nutritional facts to make a decision on whether I want to purchase those wonderful looking mini bagels or not, but also that when I'm inside the shop, I can go and click on these items and see where they're located in the store. And as I'm going and grabbing those, I can check those off in my list. And so then if I went over here and had a look in a matter of magic seconds, that seems like forever when you're presenting and trying to talk and wave hands to make that happen, is that essentially that will go through and mark that item as checked in the background as well. And so the concept here is that we make this super easy for you to kind of go back through and there you go, see those things happening in your own Microsoft product experiences, but be able to build these things into your own applications as well with the Microsoft Graph. And so this really hopefully highlights the power of what the Microsoft Graph gives you as a user here, to be able to inspire you to think about the data that you have across the variety of different areas of Office 365, either as an organization or even as a personal user in your own Outlook.com tasks and calendar and mail and files that you have signed in as a personal account. And so the best place to get started is to go to graph.microsoft.com. The Contoso Food app I just demoed, if there are developers on the call or you have developers that were interested in this, is available at the aka.ms/contoso-foods link. And so that hopefully gives you an idea about what the graph is. And now I'm going to pass back over to Brett, who's going to talk a little bit about what you can do with Microsoft Graph and the Lightning Tools products.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. That's really has been inspiring, and I think yeah, my wife is going to also be wanting that to-do list. So we'll, uh, we'll talk afterwards about that one. So hopefully we can fulfill her expectations. Excellent. So I'm just going to get going here as well with a couple of products. So what I wanted to do was talk about these products from the point of view that they are also using Microsoft Graph. And the two products, yeah, again, this audience that we're talking to here may already be aware of, but the two products that we're going to be taking a look at specifically are the permissions management tool known as DeliverPoint, and also the content aggregation tool or roll-up tool called the Lightning Conductor. And the Lightning Conductor has been around for quite some years. In fact, it was initially created sort of back in 2007 to fulfill one of the issues that we saw quite regularly in SharePoint, and that was to be able to aggregate SharePoint lists from across different site collections. And that was something back in the day that the content query web part couldn't do. So the Lightning Conductor was an offering from us that would be able to achieve that, and also make it possible for users to also be able to build views using perhaps conditional formatting and things like that as well. So let's jump into this product and see how that has sort of been developed further to also integrate with the graph, because no longer do we have to just use it to bring in content from SharePoint lists or libraries, but we can also go and get that content as well from, like I said, the Graph API, which opens it up to all sorts of things like Teams and Planner and OneDrive and things like that as well. So I'm just going to go into my demo here. Okay, so this view that we're looking at currently is something that you can do with lists, and as you can see, it's basically doing a SharePoint content aggregation using lists and rolling up some tasks, which, as you mentioned, Jeremy, is one of the things that users like to do. They like to be very task driven, and one of the challenges with SharePoint or Teams is you have lots of different tasks assigned to you in multiple different ways, including Planner now as well. So this is building an aggregated view where we can see what tasks belong to us, which ones we have to action. But we can also go and do some conditional formatting and things like that to highlight those tasks that are more important, that we really need to action as a high priority, or to be able to highlight those that we haven't started yet, or those that we've completed, and so on. And that conditional formatting we've made very simple. So it's something that you can do from within inside the actual grid. So when you're building your report, you can take your page into edit mode, and from the drop down here, you can get into your column settings and you can go straight into the conditional formatting. And this just shows some of that sort of conditional formatting that we can apply. So in here, the way that we've applied the conditional formatting on the task status column is basically by using 3 different conditions. And it really is that simple. We can just go through and select what is our value, what's the field that we're querying against, and you can go and do things like icons and choose colors of those icons and things like that until you've got the report looking how you want it to look. And we've also got things like data bars and things like that that you can integrate into the view without having to do any code of sorts. So what I wanted to focus on next was just how you can use this same product now to query Microsoft Graph. And one way of doing that, you'll notice over on the right-hand side here that I've actually got 2 different views built. One is the all tasks view, which I built earlier on, and the other one is a charts view. Should say calendar view. So the calendar view is basically taking the same tasks, but displaying those inside a calendar instead. So you've got different formats in which you can display the content. This particular one is a built-in JSON view that we created that can also be customized as well. So in order to go through and build something against the graph, what we can do is click onto this plus icon in the right-hand corner of the configuration panel. And by clicking onto configure this view, we're taking into this quick configuration where we can query lists. We can also query graph and also search as well, or we can jump into the advanced view and get a little bit more granular. So what I wanted to do first of all is just show in the drop down here, one of the graph views that we can work with is a users view. So I can select users, I can select all of the users or just guest users, which is a couple of ways that we've built in to be able to refine that. And as you can see, it's using graph in order to get that data. If I was using lists here, then where the data should come from would be things like the current site or the current site collection or hub sites and associated sites and things like that. So I'm going to use the grid view, and when we hit save, that view gets created. So we'll just give that view a name. So I'll call it users. And we're still in edit mode, but as you can see, when I click onto the drop down of the views, this is then going to go and load those users, which is in turn coming from Microsoft Graph. So here we are with our users. So we've got the principal name, display name, email address, and user type. So one of the things we could do with the user type column, if we select the drop down there, is go across to the column settings and group by that column. So now we have any guest users, any external users highlighted, and then we've also got all of our internal users as well. And of course, you could do that same conditional formatting if you wanted to as well, to highlight some of those users in a different way where they would stand out. So that's just using the sort of quick configuration, but we can also go through and build some more advanced views as well. So by clicking onto the cog icon again, I'm going to jump into the advanced mode here. And like I say, the Lightning Editor offers 3 different ways of querying the content. We can use the object model, so it's basically using CSOM in order to go and get content. We can also use search as well, so we can use search result sources in order to bring back content, or we can use the graph roll-up engine. And using graph, what I'm going to do is go across to the data source. And here under the data source, it's going to return for me all the different entities that we can go through and query. We hope, at least, anyway. That's just taking a moment, so let me just try that one more time. Yeah, there we go. Instantaneous this time. So in here is a list of different entities or data sources that we could use to query. And as you can see, we've got users, which we've already shown. We've also got things like messages that we can display as well, which would be messages that I've received. They'd be using the me, as you saw in Jeremy's demonstration. But we can also do things like calendars, events, OneDrive items, contacts, and things like that as well. What I'm going to do is bring back some planner tasks. So as I select planner task, I can then go through and build my query. And the query is based on me. I don't need to specify that, but there's other predefined queries that we can select, or you can also do a custom query if you want to in there as well. And that's basically what the query would look like. And we've got the ability to modify that if we want to. So once we've specified where that content will come from, we can go to the columns view, and in here we can go through and select which columns we want to see. So from a list of tasks, we can basically see the percentage complete. We can see the start time, the due time or due date time, and of course the title of those tasks, and simply drag those and drop those into the order in which you want those to appear. So we want the title to be the perhaps the leftmost task, and then we'll have the due date coming after the start date. So once we've selected the columns we want to see within our view, we can also apply the value type, and we can specify ordering and filtering and things like that. We can also create calculated columns, and the calculated columns allow us to build calculations that may be simple mathematical calculations, to build like concatenations or things like that. In this instance, for example, I could build a calculation that is going to work out the difference between the due date and the start date in order to give me the number of days that I have to perform the task. So there's things like that we can build into the view as well. So on the display tab, the final tab, this is where we can give some column aliases. So if we wanted to tidy that up a little bit, we could do so. We can enter all of those. We can also go through and specify the display format. So in this case, I'll set these to be short date, and the percentage complete will have set as a percent. And then there's lots of other refinements, so grouping by, conditional formatting, summary functions, and things like that. But let's just hit save, and in here you'll see that view is also available, so we can hit the drop down here. I've not named the view yet, so it's called New View 1, but here we are with our planner tasks displayed inside a view, and we can start to format them now. So hitting the drop down again on the percentage complete, by going into the formatting, we could remove that one and display the data bars instead. And so upon saving, we've now got the data bars showing us the percentage of those, and we could highlight any overdue tasks or anything like that that we want to create. So that's the first product. That's the Lightning Conductor, and how that's using Graph or can use Graph in order to bring back data within a report. The other product that I wanted to show here is DeliverPoint. And what DeliverPoint is a permissions management tool. It's a permissions management tool that is solving a couple of problems. One is it's enabling site owners and site collection administrators to produce permission reports, something that a lot of the third-party permission tools are geared around is really from a governance point of view and focusing on IT. But we really focus on those users that have full control, their site owners, their site collection administrators, and so on, and they need to be able to produce permission reports for the content that they own. And some of the challenges in that, especially with SharePoint Online, is actually going through and working out which AD groups a user might be a member of. And that's something that's really important, because if we just go into a typical SharePoint site and pull up the out-of-the-box permission reporting, we can see what SharePoint groups users are members of, and we can see that AD groups are often a member of those SharePoint groups, but we can't actually see who is a member of those AD groups from SharePoint out of the box. And that makes it really challenging as a content owner to actually be able to determine who's got rights to your content. Is there anybody externally that has rights to it? So we use, in this case, the graph to query the Azure AD, and in particular the AD group membership. We're also using it to determine the SharePoint group membership as well, and that makes up the best part of our reports. The other side of the graph that we use is, as Jeremy mentioned, is to actually just query the sites. So when we go in and produce a permission report, we do that by building a tree view so that you can see the items that you may want to query against. So in this site, just to sort of demonstrate that challenge to you, if I was to go to site permissions, we can see here we've got some site owners, we've also got some site members. In here we've got accounts payable, which happens to be an Active Directory security group within Azure AD, but we can't see who is a member of that. And in fact, if I jump down here to the advanced permission settings, the classic looking one that we all know and love. So when we go in here and we navigate into the members group, we can see that accounts payable is in there, so it's a nested AD group into a SharePoint group. But as I try to select that, I actually have no idea who may be inside that Azure AD group, so we can't determine exactly who's got access to my site that belongs to me. So how we get around that is by using some SPFX extensions and also a custom web part that we've built that makes use, like I say, of Azure AD, using the graph. And also, if I can just move the GoToWebinar panel that way, it also makes use of obviously CSOM and so on to pull up the report as well. So in here, in the drop down, I've got this Discover Permissions report, and that's going to execute against this site. So it opens it up contextually, so you don't have to go into another tool or anything like that to pull up the permissions report. And as you can see in here, we've got a list of every single user and what permission level they've had or have, and how they've also been permissioned. So if we focus on demo user 11 as an example, I can see that that user has edit permissions, and over on the right hand side here, demo user 11 is actually directly a member of a SharePoint group. But if we compare that with a few others, you can see demo user 4 is nested inside the Azure AD group called accounts payable, which is in turn a member of the members group. So we are now fully in the picture. We know exactly who's got access to this content. And like I said, that's using the graph Azure AD in order to be able to work out who's a member of these AD groups as we execute this report. So the other things we can do in here, like I said, there's the ability to pull up that report from within inside the site and just looking at the site, but also within a single view, I can also work out which items within inside this site, or also subsites as well, who has permissions to each of those. So we've got the site permissions information at the top here, but as I scroll down, I can also see list permissions and item permissions and so on. So you're not having to spend lots of time going through several clicks per folder or per document in order to be able to determine whether or not it inherits permissions or whether it has unique permissions, and then also trying to figure out who has permissions to it. So there are a couple of the reports that we can run. What we can also do is add that as a web part onto a page. So what I'm going to do is just drop another page into this site here. And we'll call that deliver point. Okay, and the web part we can add onto the page is known as deliver point. So we've already seen that as the SPFX extension. Just by dropping that into the app catalog and deploying it to your tenant, you'll have access to all of these reports. But notice here that we've now got this web part onto the page, and from that web part, I can query my whole tenant and figure out who's got permissions to all of this content. So the current site that I'm on happens to be at the top here, and we can expand that. And I can see if there are any subsites. We've also got similar views for things like hub sites and associated sites as well. What this is telling me is that subsite 2 actually inherits permissions, and we can see that just based on the fact that it has a dimmed icon versus the full color icon of subsite 1. So some of the reports that we can execute, again, if I just select these two, one of the questions we might have is, what are the differences between these two objects? So that tells me who's got permissions to each of these sites, or what the differences are between the permissions between those two sites. And we can also perform different actions around that as well. So if we wanted to copy, transfer, or delete any permissions between different users, then we can do that in bulk as well. So we can do that on anything that we select within inside this tree view, which, like I say, is also powered by the graph. And it's not just in SharePoint that we're able to report on those. We've also got the Office 365 groups in here as well, which will have a slightly different icon, and also Microsoft Teams as well. So if you're using Teams and specifically private channels, again, permissions can get quite messy. So this web part, again, powered by Graph, can also pull up those permission reports as well across those objects. Okay, so that's a taster of a couple of those products, and what I wanted to do is just open up to see if there's any questions, for Jeremy, but also for myself as well. And we've got Sandy Usia, who's also on the call to help facilitate some of those questions as well. If you want to ask a question, there is the questions panel in GoToWebinar. So feel free if you want to post a question in there. You can also use Twitter. There's a hashtag which is LTGraphWebinar. Or if you want to, if you're feeling brave, raise your hand, and what we can do is unmute you and you can ask your question as well. Okay, so at that point, I'm going to mute. Sandy, do you want to facilitate any questions?
Sure. So I actually am not seeing the whole list of attendees, but we did have one come in from Tom, and so I guess this would be for Jeremy, wondering whether everything in Office 365 is currently available in Graph, or are there still some entities or properties that are being added, and how does that?
Yeah, I think you've just cut out, but it's a great question. Thank you. So the notion of the graph is that we have the majority of the entities on there, and you can see that by exploring graph.microsoft.com and going to Graph Explorer, and actually the docs in the top navigation will list all the different things. But as an example, the SharePoint team are still on a journey to get everything on there. So I mentioned files, pages, sites, lists. We're actually in the process of reviewing the team that have taxonomy, the managed metadata APIs coming into the graph as well. And that's primarily because of the project's Cortex work that is going on. They had managed metadata on a direct API that SharePoint hosts still. But the idea is that will be on the graph. And there are a few other cases where the Teams team obviously is very new, and as Teams is moving very, very quickly, there are times where the elements aren't on the graph, but they're actively making sure that as these things come through, that they will be available in like a shorter time frame. And so the Teams team are working very aggressively to try and keep up with the APIs, public APIs on Microsoft Graph, as the product kind of expands at the rapid rate it's doing right now. And so there are definitely gaps, and the easiest way to kind of discover whether things are available is to go into our docs, and on the left-hand side do that search for whatever you're after, and it'll either return a result or it will not. And if there is something that you can't find, the best place to ask is on Stack Overflow with the Microsoft-Graph tag. And you can also request those things too. So you can go to microsoftgraph.uservoice.com and actually request new entities, and other people can vote on your feature requests. And we do a monthly triage of that list to see what things we can prioritize and have backlogs across the different engineering teams that work on the graph.
That's great. That's very helpful to know. All right. We have a question from Jayaraja, a more specific question. Can we update a document in Teams via the Graph API? I'm not sure exactly what sort of update, but...
Yeah, so if you've got a Word document or a PowerPoint or Excel document, for instance, any Office document, or any other document that is blob really, the OneDrive Files API is your way to either upload a document or delete a document or change the metadata on document. And in a Teams channel, there's this notion of files, and the Files tab is essentially just a OneDrive location, much like when I go into my OneDrive for Business, that's another OneDrive location, or if I create a document library in a SharePoint site, that's another OneDrive location. And so the Files API is capable of working with files across all those different locations. And so, yeah, you can absolutely do that. And so the demo that I showed that kind of half broke because I didn't actually create it was actually using the Files API to upload that document I'd picked off my local computer and upload it into the files location within that particular channel within the team. And so, yeah, you can absolutely do that with the Files API.
Okay, great. Question from Milan, and this might be for Brett. I'm not exactly sure of the context of the question, but it was from about 20 minutes ago, or yeah. Could you link this to Outlook 365 Mail to Task and add them as an overview for an account manager? Maybe asking whether you can have several different kinds of tasks other than just planner tasks. For example, in the Lightning Conductor, I think, is the question.
Okay, so if it is regarding the Lightning Conductor, so you could certainly build a different view for, as you saw, we had the SharePoint task lists aggregated and also the planner tasks as two different views. Could you link it to Office 365 Mail to Task? I don't know, and there might actually be more of a question for Jeremy if the entity is there that we can use, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's a few different task constructs in Office 365. You've got planner tasks, which live within plans, which live within an Office 365 group. And then there are Outlook tasks, which we've had for forever inside of Outlook. And then there are Microsoft To-Do tasks. And so all of those different user experiences will actually for the planner task, there is a specific planner task API on the graph. But for Outlook tasks and to-do tasks, wherever you create those, they actually show up in both. And so you can essentially use the graph to go create those tasks, either to show up in Outlook or to show up in To-Do. And therefore, in your Lightning Conductor web parts, you'll be able to pull through using the Outlook tasks API endpoint to get those through, or the planner tasks API endpoint to get the planner tasks through. And so, yeah, we do have that flexibility with tasks being supported for sure.
Okay, great. A question from Nishant, and I'm not completely clear on the question, but is Graph only applicable to Azure AD if we want to pull user profile info?
Good question. So when I do /me as an organizational user, that's actually going to be pulling the majority of the information from the Azure Active Directory object. But you can also pull things like skills and interests, and I forget all the different attributes that you can do when you go into like the Delve to edit your profile. And that's actually stored, as you may know if you're SharePoint people on the call, in the SharePoint user profile store. And so the graph augments a lot of profile information for a variety of different services within Office 365. There is work going on right now, actually out of our Norway team, to introduce a more advanced profile API, which is actually available in beta right now. And that is really kind of a parallel effort to what's happening with Project Cortex, where they want more insight on an individual based on like skills and projects they've worked on and interests they have and so forth, education they have, what schools they went to. And so the profile API is in beta right now and allows you to kind of go and update people's information. That isn't actually stored in Azure Active Directory. All that new rich profile information is stored within a new profile store as part of Office 365. And so the intent is over time is that the user profile service that we know and love and try to keep running on SharePoint Server, which I'm sure has caused many nights of frustration, would essentially go away and in replacement for this new profile API. So if you are interested in that, Kevin Bellinger is the PM on that, and he actually did a podcast with me on my Microsoft 365 developer show in January, but the docs are all there if you go look at the profile APIs too. And so that's something that we're, as Project Cortex spins up and they want more insights around particular topics that Project Cortex identifies, they want to be able to identify the individuals, and they'll use that profile information to do that.
Okay, all right, great. I see that Jayaraja has their hand raised, so I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question live. Hi. Hi, Jayaraja, are you there? No, maybe not. Okay, I don't see any other questions.
I think he may have just posted one additional one to the questions pane.
Okay.
Yeah. So what advantage it takes from AD app provision versus user to contribute to content in Teams? Sure. I can dim that one. But I think actually we're probably at the top of the hour anyway. So what I'm going to suggest is if there are any other questions, Jeremy, is there a sort of channel that you would prefer for any questions around Graph that you wanted to share?
Yeah, like my Twitter account's a great one. So Thake on Twitter. You can ask there, or for a broader audience, not just me, you can use that stackoverflow.com and use the Microsoft Graph tag, and we actually go through and monitor those questions that come through there. And if I can't answer them, we try and share them out across the variety of different people that know about the graph.
That's fantastic. Great. And yeah, also if there's any questions about what we've done with the graph as well, we'd be happy to answer those. You can message Sandy at Brett at lightningtools.com. So just drop me a line and I'll be happy to answer any questions there that you might have as well. And of course, the shameless plug, if you want to go and try out the Lightning Conductor and Deliver Point, you can do that by going to lightningtools.com And on the products menu, you'll see the Lightning Connector and Deliver Point, both with the SPFX versions that I demonstrated, and they're available for both SharePoint, but also Microsoft Teams as well. I don't have too much time to show that. But some news on the team stuff. We're also working with Microsoft and the personal apps at the moment. So Deliver Point, with the ability to sort of execute permission reports against Teams as well, is also in the next couple of weeks going to be available as a personal app. So it will span multiple teams, and you'll be able to produce permission reports across those. So feel free to have a go at that. And yeah, finally, I just want to really thank you, Jeremy, for joining us on this webinar. It's very kind of you to get up at the crack of dawn to deliver it for us. I know you're extremely busy, at least you tell us that you are anyway. But your knowledge of Graph is, of course, outstanding, and there's no better person to have deliver this webinar. So I really appreciate it, and thank you very much.
No, it's a pleasure. I'm always happy to help partners like yourself that have really invested on the Microsoft platform. And I've used your products in a variety of different places I've worked prior to Microsoft. And so, for people on the call, I encourage you to check them out if you haven't already, because I mean, that security thing for sure has been, even in Microsoft, a challenge to understand who's in each site. And so being able to do simple things like that very easily is super powerful. So no, it's great to see what you've done to help businesses with your products. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, I guess we'll call that a wrap. The webinar was recorded. Will be available online as well, so you can go to lightningtools.com and click onto the webinars menu at the top. Yeah, other than that, thank you very much for attending. Appreciate it.